Hello and welcome to my deck tech video on my Polymorph worm deck. Okay, I'm just gonna check that I'm actually recording. Okay. This deck came into existence in my mind at 4 a.m. one night when I woke up and had this idea. And basically, it needed to be green and red, at least, reasons I'll get into. And it so happens to be that there's a green and red worm commander legendary creature. And technically it's a Hellion, but we all know it's a worm. And so the idea of the deck actually revolves around a different worm, which is the Wellspine worm. It's an 11 mana 15/15 worm with trample. And when it dies, you put 3 5/5 worm creatures with trample onto the battlefield. And when it is put into a graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle it into its owner's library. So the plan is to get this Wellspine worm onto the battlefield. And then you play some sort of payoff for having this onto the battlefield, which we'll get into. And then you just do that over and over until you hopefully win the game. And this is the reason why the deck had to be green. And next up, we'll see the reason it has to be red. And that because the way we get this Wellspine worm onto the battlefield is using Polymorph cards. And the way Polymorph cards work is that, for example, with Transmogrify, it says exile target creature. That creature's controller reveals card from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. That player puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest into their library. And the idea is that if Wellspine Worm is our only creature in the deck, then one of these polymorph spells will always reveal Wellspine Worm and put it into play. And to use the polymorph spell, we need a target, which has to be a creature in most cases. And so the first step of this deck's plan is to create a creature. And there are 3 main ways of doing it, because the trick is that we don't really want to run any other creatures in our deck besides Wellspine Worm. So how do we get a creature onto the battlefield to use as a polymorph target? And these are the 3 cards I'm running that does this efficiently. And so the first one is Colony Garden. It is a land that enters tapped and taps for green, but when it enters, it creates a 0/1 green plant creature token. And there's also Dwarven Mind, which is a mountain, and it enters tapped unless you control 3 or more other mountains. And when it enters untapped, it creates a 1/1 red dwarf creature token. And lastly, there's Dried Arbor, which actually is a creature. So we are running 2 creatures in the deck, one besides Wellspine Worm, but it's also a land, and it's a forest. And the reason for running this card, which at first glance might be not beneficial, since it reduces the chance of a polymorph spell revealing into a Wellspine Worm from 100% to 50%, but it turns out there's a lot of way to get Dried Arbor out of the deck and onto the battlefield, and I personally think that it's a card worth running. Okay, so basically, to get our Wellspine Worm out, we need one of these 3 cards on the battlefield so that we can have a target for our polymorph spells. So how do we get these cards out, or one of these? First off, I'll start discussing Colony Garden, since it's the most straightforward way to generate a token compared to the other 2 lands, in the sense that it doesn't have any additional requirements for the token to be generated, unlike Dwarven Mine has. And it's not a creature like Dryad Arbor. And so on the right side of this slide, you can see some different ways that we can get Colony Garden from our deck. First off is crop rotation. It says as an additional cost to cast a spell, you sacrifice a land, and then it lets you search for a land and put it onto the battlefield. And Sylvan Scrying just simply tutors for a land into your hand, and the same with Nylia's Intervention, and also with Expedition Map. Our Promise takes 2 lands from our deck and puts them onto the battlefield. And Scapeshift lets us sacrifice any number of land to search our library for that many lands and put them onto the battlefield. So these cards are all ways in which we can get Colony Garden either to our hand, which we can then we can play it, or directly onto the battlefield. Now, a point about these cards is that they all search for any land, and that makes them really powerful. So these cards can also search for Dwarven Mine and Dryad Arbor. It just happens to be that there are even more cards that can search for Dwarven Mine and Dryad Arbor. And in the case of Dwarven Mine, any card that lets us get a mountain effectively also gets us Dwarven Mine. For example, Farseek, which is a sorcery that lets us search for a plain, island, swamp, or mountain and put it onto the battlefield tapped. This can get Dwarven Mine because Dwarven Mine is a mountain. And we also have the 4 red fetch lands, Arid Mesa, Scalding Tarn, Bloodstained Mire, and Wooded Foothills. These can all get a mountain card onto the battlefield, along with Mountain Valley, which is a slow fetch land. It essentially does the same as Wooded Foothills, but it enters tapped. And in the same sense, cards that get forests from our deck also can get Dryad Arbor since it's a forest. And so Misty Rainforest, Verdant Catacombs, and the Windswept Heath I've hidden down here because there wasn't enough space on the slide, along with Wooded Foothills and Mountain Valley again, can all get a forest onto the battlefield. In addition to this, there's a card like Green Sun's Zenith that lets us search for a green creature card with converted mana cost X or less and put it onto the battlefield. Since Dryad Arbor is a creature and its mana cost is 0, we can use Green Sun's Zenith for 1 mana to get it to fetch Dryad Arbor from our deck onto the battlefield. Nature's Law and 3 Visit both lets us search our deck for a forest and put it into play. And finally, Land Grant is a card that says if you have no lands in hand, you may reveal this card instead of paying it. You may reveal your hand instead of paying its mana cost, and then it lets you search for a forest card and put it into your hand. So this essentially lets us get Dryad Arbor for no mana if we have no other lands in hand. And the kind of thing about all these ways to get a token, simply from having these 3 lands or getting a polymorph target from these 3 lands, is that, first of all, they're all lands. So by themselves, they are serviceable as lands that you need in your deck. But besides that, almost all the cards that gets them onto the battlefield have another purpose in the deck besides that. Farseek, for example, lets you ramp, and all the fetch lands are lands that you need in your deck that also fixes your mana. Same is true with Nature's Law and 3 Visits and Green Sun's Zenith in that they all let you ramp. And so we have this kind of large collection of cards that lets us get a token or a creature onto the battlefield as a polymorph target without actually using up very many slots in the deck building process, since these are almost all cards that you'd play anyway, even without having this token strategy. Okay, so now that we have a token onto the battlefield or a creature onto the battlefield, it's time to use a polymorph spell on it. And polymorph is kind of an umbrella term for cards that function in this way of letting us sacrifice or destroy one of our creatures and reveal from the top of our deck until that we reveal another creature and then put it onto the battlefield. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of these in existence, so we want to run as many as we can. And this is the reason that the deck has to be red, because red has by far the most access to these polymorph spells. And since they're so important, I felt like I wanted to show them all here and go through each of them quickly, just in order to kind of showcase how they work. And they are actually slightly different. Each of them are slightly different. So we have already seen Transmogrify, which is the most traditional polymorph spell in the deck. Indomitable Creativity is a polymorph spell with an X cost that lets us polymorph X time, depending on how much mana we have, and how many targets we can target. And it has the side effect that it can target both artifacts or creatures, but it can also reveal into both artifacts and creatures. So if, for example, you run a Soul Ring in your deck, then Indomitable Creativity might reveal into that Soul Ring and put it into play instead of your Willspine Worm. So this puts a kind of deck building restriction on it. If you want to have the most out of your Indomitable Creativity, you want to run few, so to say, bad artifacts or artifacts you wouldn't want to reveal into. And then next up, there is Reality Scramble. And this one is different in the way that it does not only target creatures, but it targets any type of permanent. And you reveal into the same type of permanent as the one you targeted with the spell. So when you target a creature with a spell, you reveal into a creature. And so in that way, it functions a lot like Transmogrify. The important thing about this card is that it has retrace, which means that we can discard a land in addition to paying its mana cost, and that lets us cast it from the graveyard. And that is actually makes it one of the best polymorph spells in the deck, because we can repeatedly use it over and over again. Next up is Liquid Copper Code Outcast, which is essentially just a Planeswalker with a -2 ability that lets us polymorph. Divergent Transformation is an undaunted spell, so it costs less to cast for each opponent we have. And in a 4-player game, this costs 4 mana. And it targets 2 creatures. So it's a bit more tricky because it also reveals into 2 creatures, but it has to target 2 creatures. Fortunately, we can just target one of our opponent's creatures with it if we do not have 2 tokens. Next up is Oath Druids, and this one is kind of a special case since it does not actually require us to have any creature on the battlefield for it to target. It works in the way that if we have fewer creatures than one of our opponents, we can flip into a creature. And so this actually wants us to have no creatures at all, preferably on the battlefield when we use it. Shifting Shadow is an enchantment that grants a creature the polymorph ability when during our next upkeep. So if we use on a token, that token will during our next upkeep be sacrificed, and we will reveal until we reveal a creature and put that creature onto the battlefield. And then the Shifting Shadow will be attached to that creature. So it kind of happens every turn, every upkeep, you kind of polymorph into a new creature. Pattern of Rebirth is also kind of different in that it doesn't strictly polymorph, it doesn't reveal from the top, but when an enchanted creature dies, we can search our library for a creature card and put it onto the battlefield. So it has the additional wrinkle that we have to find a way to kill our own creature, one of our tokens that this is enchanted with, in order to get it. Next up, there's Genesis Storm, which gets copied for each time we cast our commander from the command zone, which is not going to be a lot, but it reveals until reveal a non-land permanent. And this includes planeswalkers, enchantments, and artifacts, and stuff like that. So its chances for hitting Worldspine Worm is significantly lower, and it's also a higher mana cost of 6 mana. So this is definitely more a late game card, but I still think that it's worth running just to get as high of a number of polymorph spells in the deck. And finally, we have Sylvanas Stampede, which is a Council's Dilemma card in which that each player at the table has to vote for either wild or free. And you polymorph for each wild vote, and you can put a permanent onto the battlefield from your hand for each free vote. So if you yourself vote for wild, you'll get at least one polymorph off of this. And it is into a creature, unlike Genesis Storm. So that even for 6 mana, it does the job. Okay, so that was a walkthrough of each of the polymorph spells we're running. And we want to draw at least one of these every game. And finally, there is our commander, which is also kind of a worm. And so up until now, we have talked about how to get Wellspine Worm onto the battlefield. But how do we get Thormok the Insatiable onto the battlefield? Well, essentially, it's easy enough. We cast him from the command zone. But as his text read, he has Devour X, where X is the number of creatures devoured this way. And it means that as Thormok enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. This creature enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it for each of those creatures. So you have to have some creatures onto the battlefield when you play him that you have to sacrifice, and his power and toughness becomes the square of the number of creatures sacrificed. So how do we generate a lot of creatures? Either we use Worldspine Worm, which creates 3 5/5 worms when it dies, or we use the card Field of the Dead, which is land that comes into play tapped and tapped for colorless. And when it enters the battlefield or another land enters the battlefield under our control, if we have 7 or more lands with unique names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So this is kind of a late game thing since we have to have at least 7 lands onto the battlefield, but it can essentially turn every landfall we have into a 2/2 zombie. And we don't actually need that many creatures in order for Thormok to be very huge. For example, if we sacrifice 3 creatures, it'll be a 9/9. 5 creatures, it'll be a 25/25, and 10 creatures, it will be a 100/100. So, so between 4 and up is essentially enough to get a very large body either way. Okay, so now we have our big worm onto the battlefield, and we want to utilize it. And how do we do this? We play these payoff cards, and there's essentially 3 categories of payoff cards I'm playing or considering. And the first one is draw, and these are spells like Life's Legacy that, as an additional cost to cast Life's Legacy, you must sacrifice a creature and then draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So if we sacrifice our Wellspine Worm, we will get 15 cards drawn, which is, needless to say, a very large amount. And the good thing about Wellspine Worm is that it doesn't necessarily mind dying that much, because when it dies, it creates an equal amount of power and toughness that it has itself in the form of 3 worm creatures. And it also shuffles itself back into the library so that we can polymorph it into it once again. And the second category is damage payoffs. And this is cards like Chandra's Ignition, which says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. If we have a Wellspine Worm, that's 15 damage to each creature and each opponent. If we have a Thormok with a high power and toughness, it will possibly just outright win the game if we play Chandra's Ignition on it. And lastly, there's other types of payoffs which I couldn't really find a name for, but essentially cards that, for example, like Feed the Pact, which is an enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a non-token creature. If you do, put X 2/2 green wolf tokens onto the battlefield, where X is the sacrifice creature's toughness. So sacrificing a Wellspine Worm gives us 15 2/2 wolf creature tokens and stuff like that. But so the most important payoff is definitely the draw spells, because these are the one that lets us continue to play the game and kind of do more stuff. So we kind of want to play as many of these as we can. And Life's Legacy is the best one, but there is also other ones that does not require us to sacrifice the creature. For example, Hunter's the Return of the Wild Speaker and Garrett Primal Hunter and Soul Majesty, along with Rishka's Expertise. These just draw cards equal to the greatest power of a creature we have. And then there's cards like Hunter's Insight and Hunter's Prowess that requires us to deal damage with the creature. So these are definitely a bit more dangerous to use. But if we can get a hit in, then they draw us the same number of cards. And then there's also more of these sacrifice cards like Greater Good and Momentous Falls that we have to sacrifice our worm, but they are definitely the best rate of card draw that we have. As for the damage spells, there are a lot of different ones. Not all of them are very good. We have these Thud, Fling, Kazul's Fury, which all requires us to sacrifice a creature along with Soul Blast, and then they deal a bunch of damage equal to that sacrifice creature's power. And there's cards like Soulfire and Shadow Ignition, which kind of does the same, deals a lot of damage, but does not require us to sacrifice the worm. And then there is a card like Footfall Crater, which gives a creature trample and haste. And that is very good with, for example, Thromark, since he can get very high power and toughness, but he does not have any keywords, so giving him trample and haste is very powerful. And then there's a card like Wisdom Surge, which says that whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage to its power to any target. If we can repeatedly get Wellspine Worm out and sacrifice it, we can get a lot of damage off Wisdom Surge. 15 of the worm when it enters, and when it dies, we also get 15 damage again, split up in 3 portions of 5 from worm tokens that it creates. In the other category, there's some different ones that I found interesting. For example, Metamorphosis, which is 1 mana sorcery that requires us to sacrifice a creature, but then adds mana equal to its casting cost +1 to your mana pool. Sacrificing a Wellspine Worm gives us 12 mana of any one color we want. And this can be pretty useful to extend the game and keep going with more spells. Then there's Doubling Season, which essentially makes it so that the Wellspine Worm creates 6 5/5s when it dies instead of 3. And it also makes it so that Thromark enters the battlefield with twice as many counters on it. And that could be a lot. Traverse the Outlands, let us find a ton of basic lands if we have Wellspine Worm on the battlefield. And Altar of Dementia is an interesting one where we can mill we can sacrifice a creature in order to mill someone. And I'm not completely sure if milling is a viable strategy, but for example, with a Thromark, that's a 100/100. Altar of Dementia, which will just completely mill one of our opponents out of the game. Then we have Molten Echoes and Flame Shadow Conjuring. These are both cards that lets us generate a token copy of a creature whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield. And this is essentially 2 Wellspine Worms instead of 1, which is pretty cool. and that token also gains haste, and it is exiled at the beginning of the next end step, which is a shame since we kind of want our Wellspine worm token to die so that it can generate more worm token for us. But if we have a way to sacrifice the token copy, then we can get that anyway. Feed the pack we have talked about, and then there's Eldritch Evolution, which is a kind of interesting one in that way that we have to sacrifice a creature, and then we can fight a creature that costs 2 more than the sacrificed creature or less. But since Wellspine Worm is our only creature, we can just find Wellspine Worm again, since Wellspine Worm will shuffle itself into its library if we use it as a sacrifice, and this will happen before Eldritch Evolution is resolved so that we can find Wellspine Worm itself. And this is basically a way of creating 3/5/5 worms with trample for 3 mana if we have Wellspine Worm onto the battlefield. Okay, and so that was the kind of the main idea. Get a big worm onto the battlefield and play some spell that utilizes a high power or high toughness creature being on the battlefield. Now I want to go into some other stuff in which to showcase some other considerations I have made for the deck, and how to kind of smooth everything out. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the land toolbox. Then I'm going to talk about rummaging and recursion and intrinsic win con, and how much interaction and what kind of interaction we want to be running. Lastly, I'm going to be talking about running more than one worm. So, the land toolbox. So, as we previously have seen, there is a ton of different land tutoring cards in the deck, and these are primarily used to find the 3 creature generating lands that we have. But it also comes with this additional side effect, and it allows us to basically play a toolbox style with our lands. Since we have a lot of land tutors, we can also play other utility lands that we can get. For example, Gaia Reach Sanitarium, which lets us draw a card and discard a card. This is very good if we have Wellspine Worm in our hand and want to get rid of it. High Market is a kind of a curious case. It taps to sacrifice a creature and gives us 1 life, which on the surface is not so good, but I wanted to include it since one of the big downsides of the deck is having Wellspine Worm getting exiled. If we are afraid of it getting exiled to, for example, a Swords to Plowshares, we can fetch High Market and let it stay in play untapped, so that whenever our Wellspine Worm becomes targeted with a exile remove spell, we can in response sacrifice it ourselves, which lets it get shuffled back into the deck. And even though the payoff for sacrificing it is only 1 life, it's far better to have the opportunity to get it on the field again than have it exiled for the rest of the game. Then there's also Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, which can kind of act as a removal piece, letting our mountains deal 3 whenever they enter. There is also Mirren, the Moaning Well, which is kind of like a big brother of High Market, in that it also sacrifices a creature to gain us life, but we have to pay an additional cost. And but however, the life we gain is a lot more. So this is not really something to use in response to an exile effect, since the activation cost is so huge that we can't really afford to keep 4 mana up. But it is a way to gain a lot of life, especially with Thramak, potentially hundreds, a ton of life. In the same way, Witch's Clinic can give our Thramak lifelink, which can also just be like 50 to 100 life gain. Immersion Zone lets us cast spells as though they had flash, and this is kind of cool for a stalled out game board where we need to do something in our opponent's end step in order to get something through. Lastly, or not lastly, but next is Reliquary Tower. This makes it so that we have no maximum hand size, and this can actually be pretty relevant with a lot of our big draw spells that we're running. Skag the Rage Pit lets a creature get +1/+1 and trample. This could be pretty nice with our commander, letting it get through a lot of combat damage. Raw Room lets us draw cards if we are really running out of gas. And Rogue's Passage can let our Wellspine Worm or Drummer be unblockable for a turn. And next up, I want to talk about some rummaging and recursion. So because of this deck is kind of clunky in the way that we have a lot of worm payoff spells, but we might not always have the worm onto the battlefield, and these spells then become pretty useless. On the other hand, we might have a lot of ways to get the worm onto the battlefield, but we might not have any way to pay us off from having it there. So rummaging cards away. And in addition, we are also always on the lookout for a polymorph spell. We are only running 10 and we want one at least every game. So if we don't have it at our opening hands, having some way to get closer to it and the form of card draw is very good. Faithless Looting and Cathartic Reunion lets us discard the pieces that we don't need and hopefully draw into some we need or a polymorph spell. Wheel of Misfortune and Refresh the Soul lets us discard in our entire hand and draw a new 7 in order to get closer to that polymorph spell or in order to get some useful cards if we don't have the worm onto the battlefield, or we do have the worm onto the battlefield but we don't have any payoff cards. And Valakut Awakening in the same way lets us put away the cards we don't need right now, the pieces we don't need, and draw a new set of cards. With all these rummaging and discard effects, it's also important to then, if we discard some pieces that we don't need, to be able to get them back later. This is especially the case since we're only running a finite number of polymorphs. So having drawn one, we often want to polymorph again in order to get our worm out again if it has been killed or something like that. And we could draw into another polymorph spell, but we don't have a lot of good draw options in this deck. And another way is to simply return it from the graveyard to our hand so that we can use it again. And Balagat Recovery and Weave is one way of doing this. Mystic's Mastery is also a way of casting spells from the grave. Life from the Loam is a different kind of card in that it won't allow us to get our polymorph spells back, but it can get our lands back from the graveyard, which can, with all the different utility lands we are running and the token generating lands, which are very key, can be kind of important. Lastly, there's Gaia's Blessing, which I'm not sure is needed in the deck, but it can shuffle a graveyard back into a library and draw us a card. So if we are somehow getting locked out of the game from our key pieces being in our graveyard, we can get it all back into the deck in order to continue. And so the deck essentially is winning through combat, attacking with the Wellspine Worm and its tokens, or giving Thormak trample and attacking with that. And I have been thinking about having some more powerful win conditions in the deck. And one of them is that of Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle. If we have a Prismatic Omen in play, lands you control are every basic land type in addition to the other type. We can sort of make all our lands into mountains, which will trigger Valakut's, the Molten Pinnacle's ping ability. And then sometimes we draw a huge number of cards, and for example, 15 of Life Legacy or even more, and maybe we can change into multiple card draw spells and draw 30 cards, something like that. In that case, we are very likely to draw Prismatic Omen and Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle. And then in combination with Mana Bond, which is a card that says during your discard phase, you may choose to put all land cards from your hand into play, and if you do, discard the rest of your hand. Well, if we're sitting with 30 cards in our hand, and 10 of them maybe are mountains, or are lands, which in turn are mountains because of prismatic omen, and with Valakut in the hand or on the field, having mana bond can essentially let us play all our lands, getting a bunch of Valakut triggers doing our instead. Another way to win from having a very large hand is Firestorm, which is a 1 mana instant that just lets us discard X card to deal X damage to X targets. So if we have 30 cards or 40 cards in hand, we can just deal 40 to 40 different targets. And yeah. Finally, there's Lightning Storm, which is a card that lets you pitch land cards in order for it to deal more damage. And this is kind of one of the weaker ones, since your opponents can also do this, and each time somebody pitch a land, they can change the target of Lightning Storm. So you have to be careful with it, but it's still a pretty cool card. And so if you find yourself drawing a ton of cards and your hand is just so massive and you don't know what to do with it, then these cards can just outright win you the game if you have a large enough hand. Okay, so moving on to talking a bit about interaction. Now, on the top row, the 4 cards here are kind of synergistic interaction pieces, and on the bottom row, I've just included some of my favorite interaction in the colors. So artifact mutation just destroys an artifact and creates X/1/1 sapling creature tokens. This synergizes well with our polymorph strategy and with our commander. And Ragnar Genesis creates X Ace of Bark effects that also lets you get a ton of spiders. And this is also gets us tokens for our polymorph, gets us tokens for our commander. In the same way, Pest Infestation destroys artifacts or enchantments and creates tokens. And Pierce Whim is an interesting one in where that we can get to search our library for a land card, and each opponent sacrifices an artifact or enchantment. The sacrifice an artifact or enchantment is not very good, since most people often have a treasure token or something like that lying around that they can just sacrifice. But the getting a land from your library onto the battlefield part is very good, with a lot of our very nice utility lands, and especially Field of the Dead, which can get us a lot of tokens. Now, in the deck already, there's a lot of way of dealing with creatures in our different worm payoff cards that lets us target a creature with damage or wipe the board, for example, with Chandra's Ignition. But there's not a lot of way dealing with non-creature permanents. So Dire Strain Rampage, which lets us destroy an artifact, enchantment, or land in one case, and in the other case lets us ramp. It's a nice option. Veil of Summer is also very nice, since we can give our worms hexproof until the end of the turn for blue or black spells. So this can prevent a bounce spells like Brazen Borrower, and it can prevent a destroy spell or an exile effect also if it's in the colors blue and black. And at the same time, it cantrips, so the opportunity cost of running it is very low. Tabel's Trickery is in the same way a very nice protection spells. It is in that it can counter a spell, which is very important if someone tries to exile one of our worms or do something another thing. Lastly, there's Beast Within and Cast Warp, which are just generic good green and red removal staples. Okay, so this is the last slide, and here I'm talking about another more worms in quotations, because they're not actually all worms. Well, the first one is a Symbiotic Worm is an 8 mana worm creature that's a 7/7, and when it is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put 7/1/1 green insect creature tokens onto the battlefield. And this is pretty nice. The 7/7 stats are not obviously not 15/15, so the pair of cards are not going to be as amazing, but it does generate 7/1/1 green insect creature tokens, which 7 squared is 49. So it does let us create a 49/49 Thramak worm, which will in turn have a great payoff. So definitely an interesting option. Next up is Stormblade Regent. It's a 8/8 elk, and when it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. And as long as you're the monarch, permanents you control have hexproof. So the main downside of including more creatures than Wolfspine Worm is that you of course have the possibility of revealing into those creatures instead of Wolfspine Worm. And one of the things I want, if I have to include more creatures, is that I want them to do something that lets me then go into a Wolfspine Worm should I go into these cards first. And Dawnglade Regent kind of does this in a way that it's a pretty nice setup card. If we flip into this first, we become the monarch and immediately draw a card in our end step. So it kind of replaces itself. And then it makes it so that our permanents have hexproof. This creates a nice setup for a Wolfspine Worm or Thramak combo in the sense that we can kind of get to do whatever we want as long as this card is onto the battlefield because all our permanents have hexproof. If we don't need the hexproof, an 8/8 is a pretty respectable creature for our pair of cards, and so this one is actually a pretty good option, I think. Next up, and another thing about these cards is why would you even include more cards? Well, in some cases, having only one polymorph target in the form of a Wolfspine Worm may be kind of risky, because if someone exiles it or finds a way to deal with it, we are kind of left with a lot of dead cards in our hand. Even just having one or two more creatures in the deck that can use some sort of similar effect as Wolfspine Worm gives us a lot more resilience to getting our Wolfspine Worm removed. And Titanite Rex is an 11-level trample, and that's all it does. But it has the effect of being able to cycle itself. So if we end up with this card in our hand, we can just cycle it away. And when we cycle it, we can put a trample counter on a target creature we control. This has the additional upside in that if we have our commander Thramak onto the battlefield, and as we have previously discussed, giving Thramak Trample is very powerful. We can cycle this card in order to give our commander Trample, and in a way, kind of, in that way, it can kind of mitigate a lot of its downsides. So first of all, if we draw it, we can just cycle it away, and then which might be just only okay, but then sometimes it's actually very good to cycle it. And in by itself it's an 11/11 creature, which is pretty good for all our payoff cards. Next up we have Avenger of Syndicate and Dragonlair Spider. These are just creatures that come in and create a bunch of tokens. Yeah, I don't really know if these are better or worse than something like a Symbiotic Worm. They give you the tokens straight up, or in Avenger of Syndicate's case at least, we get them straight up. Dragonlair Spider, we probably get a lot of tokens in a turnaround table. And this is also kind of good, but sometimes I also think that we should be careful of not going overkill with the tokens, because they are only really useful for getting a huge commander, and we don't really need that many tokens to get our Thramak to be huge. So having, for example, 20 tokens is not really more beneficial than having 10, and having 10 is probably not any more beneficial than having something like 7 or even 6. So even though these cards can generate a ton of tokens, that might not actually be worth it. And next up we have Ulvenwild Hydra, and this one is pretty interesting. It's a 6-mana Hydra with reach, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. And when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So in the same way as Dawnblade Regent is a nice setup card for our worm, our Willspine worm. Overboard Hydra is also a kind of nice setup card. If we happen to polymorph into this card and not our Willspine worm, we can get, for example, Field of the Dead in order to extend the game and almost guarantee getting more tokens to be able to polymorph again. And its power can become respectable in the late stages of the game. So I think I might include this card if I find that Field of the Dead really overperforms and I want that card on the battlefield as much as possible, or any other land, because the ability to tutor land is very strong in this deck, so it might just be worth it to run this card for that ability alone. And next up we have Dark Depths and Thespian Stage, and these kind of come as a pair. And these are very unique in the sense that Dark Depths is a land, and it's also a land that cannot tap for mana. It enters with 10 ice counters on it, and you can pay 3 mana to remove an ice counter from it. And when it has no ice counters on it, you sacrifice it and create Marit-Lage, a legendary 2020 black avatar creature token with flying and indestructible. Well, the way you get this one is that you play Thespian Stage, and then you use Thespian Stage ability for it to become a copy of Dark Depths. Now, the legend rule will apply, and you'll have to choose one of these to go to the graveyard, and you choose the original Dark Depths. Then Thespian Stage, which is now a copy of Dark Depths, will have no counters on it since it didn't enter the battlefield as a copy, but rather it became a copy after it had entered the battlefield. And then it will trigger its ability and sacrifice itself in order to create a 2020 flying indestructible creature. This is a very cool way of getting a large body onto the table that can really try to win the game with flying and indestructible. And also, it's very powerful with our payoff cards. Since we are running a very big land toolbox and are running a lot of land searching cards, getting Dark Depths and Thespian Stage onto the battlefield shouldn't be that hard again. And with cards like Life from the Loam, you can even recur these cards back to your hand and play them again. Now, the downside is that Dark Depths doesn't really do anything without Thespian Stage. It does not even tap for mana. But since we are running so many land fetching cards, so many land tutoring cards, I think the Dark Depths and Thespian Stage is a combo that is worthwhile playing. Finally, we have a Bloodshot Cyclops, which is just a fun card, really. It's a 6 mana 4/4, and you can tap it to sacrifice a creature, and it throws that creature at a creature or player. And I just wanted to include it because it's kind of like fun in the case that you polymorph out a Willspine worm and then you sacrifice it to this to deal 15, and then you just keep doing that over and over until you kill somebody. How good it is? Probably not a lot, but I just wanted to include it. Okay, so that was all for my deck tech. I hope I didn't miss anything, and thank you for watching.